Nau mai, hoki mai, kia ora fold, e mihine, ko Duncan Greive tōk. Last week, Glenn and I responded to a pair of columns from Shane Curry at The Herald and Patrick Smelly at Business Desk, each of which addressed a problem which is increasingly central to the challenges facing institutionalised media. How will we pay for it? The question arises because advertising, which used to fund so much of what we read, watched and listened to, news, reality TV, current affairs, is unlikely to ever do so again. The production companies who make shows for TV, as well as the networks which screen and stream it, are asking for an expansion of rebates to try and regenerate their much diminished local show slates. But what if this is a battle we cannot win? At least on the terms that we're currently litigating it. That question came from Dylan Reeve, a Fold listener who messaged me on Saturday night after listening to the episode. He suggested we might be looking at it the wrong way around. I quote here, "You're framing it as, what can be done to save the status quo," he wrote, whereas I think we're past that. The question needs to be, what do we want to achieve in terms of telling New Zealand stories? It's a provocative question, if a very fraught one. Implicit in it is the idea that multinational streaming services, social media and user-generated content has already won. As someone who has very deliberately left social media, who believes it to be the source of so much of what bedevils the world today, I kind of hate the idea that we will just concede that the barbarians own our minds. But equally, the people have spoken, and we need to acknowledge that advertising is down because ratings are down, and local, professionally made content is just a lot less popular than it once was. The reason Dylan is a particularly fascinating person to be making this argument is that he has spent most of his working life at the very production companies and networks asking for a helping hand. His work is typically in the behind-the-scenes world, job titles like post-production supervisor or post-production director. But he's done that for some of the most iconic shows in our history, across drama, comedy and reality TV, including The Traders, Treasure Island, Tickled, Creamery, Shortland St, Outrageous Fortune, The Jackie Brown Diaries, and more. He also worked for the spin-off on our internet series IRL, which is one way of saying that there are few people better qualified to assess this debate, particularly from the view of the shop floor, and who have such a personal stake in the outcome. Kia ora, Dylan. Welcome to The Fold.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder if you could start by giving me a sense of the kinds of work you've done in television over the years.
Yeah, I guess I've spent 20-something years in post-production predominantly. So I've worked across reality, little bit of kind of current affairs adjacent work, some sport. But I spent 10 years as the head of post-production at Shortland St, so I've spent a long time there. And then more recently I've been doing a role called post-producing or post-directing on unscripted television mainly.
And I sort of look at your career and it, you know, over that period that you've been active, there aren't many of the real kind of tentpole shows that you haven't at least dipped a toe in, if not had a lengthy engagement with. I just wondered if you could pick two or three that were particularly sort of interesting or satisfying, just to kind of give a sense of where you've worked and what the nature of that work was. Yeah,
I guess it's interesting. Straight out of film school, I got a job at Touchdown, which, you know, was the epicenter of reality TV in New Zealand at the time. So I spent.
This is Julie Christie's kind of original baby.
So I spent 9 months working there, which felt like, you know, in work terms, felt like 4 years. And that's sort of a discussion about what working in television was like at the time. But so, you know, while I was there, I worked on a handful of shows. The Player, not Finding Jay Smith. What was it? Living the Dream. Really enjoyed that. It was a fun show. But then, yeah, it sort of disappeared into regular, you know, sort of job work, television and post-production houses and the like. And then came out of that briefly back through Touchdown, which had become iWorks by that point, and then into 10 years at Shortland St, which was obviously significant. Like that's, you know, 2,500 odd episodes of television I laid hands on. And then, more recently in unscripted television with The Block, Treasure Island, a show called My Family Mystery, which I really enjoyed working on, and The Traitors twice on different sides of the camera.
Very true.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there wouldn't be many people who have had more of a sense of what, how the various sausages are made, especially with the reality, drama, some comedy, some current affairs.
Yes, certainly. I mean, my experience is a little more at the the meat grinder end of it, rather than I haven't been in a lot of network pitch meetings, and I'm not in the executive suites making decisions. But for sure, I've been around a lot of television at different sort of stages and types of TV.
And that's why I thought it would be good to have you on, because a lot of the time I'm speaking to people who are at the commissioning and the big high level thought kind of aspect of it. And so when we have discussions like we typically do on this show, they can be a bit abstracted from how is this kind of landing on the shop floor. Can you give me a sense of how it's feeling for you and the people that you've worked with and that you're in touch with in recent times in the TV production landscape at the moment?
I would broadly say it's a bit fucked. So, normally in a year, especially in the unscripted space, you'd have, a couple of big shows probably mostly coming out of Warner Brothers International Television Production, which is distinct from Warner Brothers Discovery, the broadcaster. It used to be called iWorks, used to be called Touchdown. They bring you, usually you can kind of expect a Treasure Island and maybe a block, and sometimes another show like a Married at First Sight or an F-Boy Island, which we don't talk much about. But, it's a big show that kind of employs a fair number of people, especially in post-production, for a good, 3-4 months. Sort of in that space, employs quite a lot of people on the ground in production. It's a big deal. There's been none of those this year, and it sort of doesn't currently look like there will be, because the nature of the funding has changed, which is what you were talking about last week with Glenn. Yeah,
I mean, and that's kind of this thing that, underlying that is this a temporary, this is just a bad year, or is this a new reality? And that, if you'll pardon the pun, that reality TV, those purely commercially funded shows, are never coming back, in which case these are, dozens, probably hundreds of roles that were kind of, that kept running, that made those shows, those very popular shows that you referred to, that what's your sense of it within the industry?
I think so. If you look at when Warner Brothers Discovery sort of scaled back their operation, they ended News Hub and said, we're not people interpreted what they said as, we're not going to make local television anymore. But what they actually said was, we're not going to spend our own money to make local television anymore. And so if you want to see a reality TV show or any sort of TV show on TV3, it's going to be funded by either New Zealand On Air or a commercial partner. And that's the case. And they were sort of upfront and out about that. TVNZ's kind of done the same thing. They haven't announced it as much, but TVNZ's in a similar spot where they are not, they don't have the money to make the kind of commercial funding decisions they used to. So now the entire sort of television industry is dangling off 3 NZ On Air rounds a year, which is, I don't know how sustainable it is, but it's not going to give us the same kind of TV we were used to. Like the money for making a Treasure Island or a block, it's quite high, and the commercial sort of imperative that made it possible before maybe isn't there anymore. And NZ On Air has, that it's inherently political what they do, because even if there's a great argument for funding those, and I would say there probably is, it's gonna catch attention, right? People are gonna make press releases about, oh my God, they're funding Treasure Island, or oh my God, why are we spending taxpayer money on this junk, which is already the sort of flack they catch for a lot of things anyway.
The irony is that they can make a lot of relatively unpopular shows that play outside of prime time, that maybe don't get particular prominence on streaming platforms, and that's uncontroversial. But if they were to fund something that's very popular and dominates prime time, gets a lot of streams, then that becomes sketchy.
Yeah, and the public funding model's always kind of had like a bit of eat your vegetables about it, right? Like there's always been this sort of sense that it's for the important grown-up things, and you can have your dessert because, sanitarium's paying for it, or, whomever.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess that was all predicated on the assumption that the dessert would always be there, that was funded by the ads, and
and in theory, the dessert was supposed to bring people, right? They were coming in. You bring the audience because they want to watch the big, flashy, expensive shows, and while they're there, they see some promos for another show that catches their interest, or they just happen to, stay on the channel for a little while longer, or whatever it is.
So the reason we're talking today is that you sent me a text on Saturday night, and I mean, I have to question some choices of yours here. That you'd said you'd just finished listening to the Fold.
I hadn't just finished listening, but I was just suddenly reminded a little while after I'd finished listening. It wasn't like I was listening to you at 11 o'clock at night for,
Okay, good. I would be.
It was while I was doing the dishes.
Immensely troubled if you had been. But what you said was it really struck me as quite an interesting, like I said, a provocation, particularly given that you have made your living for decades out of the sort of traditional production sector for television. Do you want to kind of just relay it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was responding to is the discussion that you and Glenn were having about what funding models look like, especially what a government-based funding model looks like, whether that's NZ and ERA and the Film Commission, or whether there's some sort of new entity that comes about, and whether that can fund your CTIs and your the blocks
to play on
play
TV
those
and
kind of TV, and sort of my thinking about this, and it has been for a while, is I don't know if we're asking the right question about, or if we're starting from the right place. I think we're starting from the end, and we need to go back to the beginning and think about, like, what do we want to achieve with funding? Because I think there's a risk that if we just kind of treat things as the status quo, try to protect the status quo of, just putting some television shows on TV and just letting it carry on the way it has, that we actually end up losing those platforms, that TV3 and TVNZ, because we're not using them right, or because we just kind of assume they will always be there, disappear, and we no longer have those kind of mass platforms anymore. And the question is, what's the purpose of that funding? And I would assume that my feeling is that it's to tell New Zealand stories. And those stories are varied, hugely, massively varied. They have different audiences. Some of them are the block, and some of them are, a teeny YouTube show. I worked on a show called The Gender Agenda, which was a small, 6 episodes, I think it was for YouTube as a primary deliverable. And those are like different sort of New Zealand stories. But at the moment, to get New Zealand On Air funding, your product has to be in most cases, has to be on a platform. So TVNZ, TV3, Sky Open, Whakata Māori, and then, the spin-off RNZ stuff, The Herald, all kind of count as platforms as well to be supported. So that's one thing. And your content has to be freely available to New Zealanders. Now, I can't remember the exact number. I'll bring it up on my laptop in a second. But like most New Zealanders now aren't watching linear TV, and they're certainly not watching video on, the spin-off or RNZ or stuff. Like those numbers are smaller, and TVNZ is becoming a minority.
And TVNZ Plus is doing incredibly well.
Sure, it's doing incredibly well.
And yet more than half of the country never watches on it.
Yeah,
according to the Where Are the Audiences survey. So you're right that there's this tension, and that there is nothing that has remotely the kind of scale and impact of the old system that has been generated in the new one. So what is the right question to ask then?
I think the right question is, what do we want to achieve from funding? And I would argue that's telling New Zealand stories. And then the next question is, to who? And that's New Zealanders. And so then the next question is, how? And I think that's funding a variety of content at a variety of levels. But we also need to consider things like, okay, so in the most recent Where the Audiences study that NZ On Air did, which was the end of last year, or near the end of last year, 56% of New Zealanders watch an SVOD platform every day. So that's a Netflix, a Disney Plus, a
Amazon
Prime. And 64% are watching a global streaming platform, which is YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Those only 27% of 15 to 39-year-olds are watching television on any given day. And that includes, that's linear television, 30%, so just a smidge more, engage with New Zealand broadcast VOD. So
TVNZ Plus 3 now.
Yeah. So, do we need to consider that maybe we need to be supporting content onto Netflix, onto Disney Plus, onto, Amazon Prime, do we need to be dropping some of the platform requirements and putting more original content on YouTube? Like Viva La Dirt League is a YouTube channel. They've successfully commercialized themselves, but they reach a huge audience on YouTube, just on YouTube. They don't need a platform to support them.
But isn't the argument against that? And I'm a huge admirer of Viva La Dirt League, but you'd have to imagine that the New Zealand audience is probably in the single digits. So the two tension points to me are like, one is if there is no commissioner, then how do you does it become New Zealand On Air's job to sort of figure out what it is that's going up and how it relates to everything else, and is it not non-harmful or whatever?
Yeah. So at the moment, if you can apply to New Zealand On Air for funding for rangatahi content without a platform attached. So you can, for that specific audience, you can apply for funding that goes direct onto a social media platform. In order to do that, you have to sort of outline a good example of how you replace the functions of what a platform would do. So how you replace sort of a commissioning oversight. So do you bring in a consultant producer who can sit at sort of an executive level and look over your show and give you the kind of feedback that a network would give you? And you also have to make sure you've got the sort of legal and accounting things crossed off as well. The stuff that a network or a platform would do. There are ways we can handle it, but I think the problem is if we just focus on the status quo, that just keeps that number on the little graph and the where are your audiences just keeps dying down, and the places we're investing most of our money are getting fewer and fewer eyeballs, are becoming less and less viable anyway, and we end up in a space where we're going to have fewer and fewer ways to tell our stories to New Zealanders. And I think that's, the risk is that we can't tell our stories anymore.
That's the sort of question that sits uneasily behind a lot of the discussions we have. And like I said, there's the who is the commissioner and how do you check that it's sort of on the level part. And you have to be really careful with that, because if the person is, or the platform is too activist, or if New Zealand On Air is, they can risk piling on too many kind of socio-cultural imperatives to the point where it gets bland and loses the impact of the creator. And then there is the second thing is like, how will you know that New Zealanders are actually watching it? Because there's always that other tension, which is, yes, you can put things on a global platform, but they're competing with everything else in the world.
Of course. And I think my thinking is that we need to do what we can to keep some amount of that content out there. I mean, we can't force people to watch it, nor should we. But at the moment, if you go on a Netflix or Disney Plus, there's virtually no New Zealand voices on there, like almost never, and nothing we are doing as a country, as a government or whatever, is doing anything to change that. So, whether that is opening up NZ On Air funding to content that would land on that as the primary platform, or whether that is doing something more, a bit more of a stick rather than the carrot, trying to require a certain percentage a content minimum, something like that. But we're in a situation where if we just keep focusing on our two main TV channels and a few other little platforms, that if we're talking about an audience reach and stuff like that, those numbers are getting smaller. And if you look every week, I think I get in my email from NZ On Air, like, here's the stuff we funded and what it rated. And you go three spots down that list and the numbers are very small.
Yeah, the reruns of Country Calendar.
Yeah, reruns of Country Calendar at the top.
Dominating.
And then it's dripping down.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And I understand, like, it's a challenging idea because part of the principle of public media is free accessibility. And as soon as you're behind Netflix's or Amazon's or Disney's paywall, yes, you've got this tension. That's where the biggest audiences are, or some of the biggest audiences are, and some of the most committed TV watching audiences, which, that's the problem with a TikTok or an Instagram. They're not there to watch what New Zealand On Air have conventionally funded. And, it might not even be a place where that can ever really thrive in a narrative sense. But it's a paid product, and the people who aren't paying for it are probably some of the audiences that you most
I think one of the things to consider at the moment is that right now the TV platform, or all the platforms, are putting in very little money. So it used to be, if you made a show with NZ On Air, it was often that NZ On Air was was investing some of the money, and the broadcaster or platform that commissioned it was investing also quite a lot of money. And so that funding was kind of shared. That's changed sort of quite a lot. The money that's coming from the broadcasters is much less. Now, obviously, your bigger platforms have money to spend. So maybe part of a forward-looking thing looks at how you can incentivize that stuff. You can make some sort of levy-based, rebate-based, a carrot for them to want to make television for our audiences and here, and also give them an opportunity to access some of the funding. Maybe if that gets it across the line, maybe that's useful. Maybe there's a requirement for some level of, maybe every time I go into Netflix from New Zealand, I should have a New Zealand content bar across the top, just like any other thing. So
some of this is what was tabled in the MCH's discussion document. And, it's interesting, right? Like I was just reading this morning a joint submission from John Barnett, Matthew Metcalf, and I think there was a third party in response to the MCH discussion document, which mentioned that and then talked through the downsides, of you're trying to get TV manufacturers. This is if you're going another layer again to have a sort of must carry on the TV home screen. And they also pointed out that the cost of an episode of drama for Netflix sort of starts at US $10 million. So that would be a whole season for us. So if they, I think it's almost like every direction you turn, there is a reason why this is going to be incredibly difficult. The problem is the longer that we don't engage with that, and I think this is the point you're making, is we're just shrinking and shrinking the pot, and the audience that is almost guaranteed to never see a New Zealand product is growing, or at least a New Zealand On Air funded, a sort of a vetted New Zealand product is growing larger all the time.
Yeah, and that's sort of exactly what I'm thinking. And as we drift further and further towards that, we get to a space where we don't have an opportunity to change it, or where everything's changed too much. Like, part of it is I would really like to see, without any sort of specific changes to anything, I would really like to see more local production funded by the international streamers. And what you're saying, like those episode costs, like I think we funded in the last round a 8 episode drama for TV3 for like $2.5-3 million. Like that's nothing for a Disney Plus. And those shows, like I see all kinds of content on Netflix that isn't targeted to me. I want the industry to do well. I want to have a job. Like we could be making these things here, but we just need to think about what is both going to get our stuff to a New Zealand audience, make sure New Zealand audiences can see their own stories wherever they are, and we need to think about what it means to get those stories to those places, and whether we have to spend money to do that, or whether we have to change legislation to do that in order to, kind of force some of the international streamers in some way. But we're getting to a place where the amount of New Zealand content and the places we can see it are getting smaller and smaller, and the audiences there are getting smaller and smaller. Like there are kids in my children's school, there are kids who speak with American accents who have never been to the States because their entire media diet is American. And that's, I don't know if that's a great thing or not, but it would be nice to at least sprinkle a little bit of New Zealand content where they are.
Doesn't sound like a great thing.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's helpful for them in the future.
I remember
they can order properly at a McDonald's in the States.
True. There was definitely a moral panic in the 90s that kids in Milton Keynes, like in Newtown in the UK, were growing up with Australian accents because of the Neighbours and Home and Away effect.
That's not a problem anymore.
No, absolutely. The other thing that came out of John and Matthew's submission, which I thought was particularly relevant, is, and this is a tension that we don't talk about enough, I don't think, is that when through a New Zealand On Air lens, we both create for and really conceptualize productions that are entirely inward-looking in terms of New Zealand audiences.
Yeah.
And yet the reality, and this is proven by New Zealand On Air's own research, is that New Zealanders the volume of us who care about whether something is from New Zealand and is about New Zealand is relatively low. And so if you change the thinking in the way that you're describing, you also naturally test the idea that it should be, that should be quite such a hardcore mandate, and that once you do that, you might, by looking at a global audience, by putting it on a global platform, and by making it less strictly and intensely about this country, you might actually paradoxically attract a bigger New Zealand audience because you're not being so self-conscious about its origins effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a thing that happens, I think, when applying for NZNE funding, and you've probably been through this, where you kind of end up writing a funding pitch that you think is the funding pitch that NZNE wants to hear, right? You're pitching to what you believe they want, and that's not necessarily what you think is going to be the best for an end audience or what would do well on an international streaming platform. If you made me, Minister of Culture and Heritage tomorrow, I would want to make at least one of TVNZ's channels a public interest broadcaster, like we vaguely almost got towards a while ago. And I would want to do things that would I would want to make changes to our relationship with international streamers that would encourage them to invest more in New Zealand, be that both in New Zealand stories but also just in international production here. Because I think you can achieve both things, right? You can have different needs for different places. If you want to have content that is very specifically New Zealandy content, then that can be, on a New Zealand broadcaster, if you could make a TVNZ1 to be more of a non-commercial entity and to not have those same sort of commercial imperatives about programming decisions, you could put content there. You could also have it as a second window into international streaming platforms if it helped. There's lots of ways to approach it, but at the moment it feels like, and the MCH discussion document aside, it feels like we're kind of not doing anything to sort of, there's been a long time in the industry where it's felt like broadcasters and production companies and advertising agencies have kind of been like, it's just a little thing, it's just going to change, we're going to get back to normal, and I don't think there is ever going to be a back to normal. And if we don't sort of confront head on that back to normal isn't happening, and we just keep trying to, we'll just sprinkle a bit more NZNE funding into it, or whatever it is.
Open the spur window even wider.
Yeah, open the spur window wider, whatever it is, those little things are tinkering around the edge. The idea of opening the spur window for, the block, for example, is great, but you still need to find the other 60%, and that 60% is they could probably make the block,
but maybe for one more year
if they had to, If that 60% was available, they could probably still make the block somehow. But those things are good, but you also then you end up to be an unscripted show supported by Spur, you need a qualifying production expenditure of $250,000 an hour, which is then actually an expensive reality show. So it's fine for the block and Treasure Island, but it's not going to work for some of the smaller shows, which still have to find funding from somewhere. So it's like we're just taking the system as it exists right now and going, we can sprinkle a little bit of money in here and there, and hopefully everything will be fine. And I think what we need to do is we need to really think about what we want to achieve with media in this country, be it through employment, through telling our stories, through making sure media is available where people want to watch it. And I think a lot of the discussion just has to be slightly shifted with that frame.
Do you think that this is... Because on some level that would require a bit of a blank sheet of paper, because a lot of what we're doing is about trying to extend the life of existing businesses and audiences and productions, and we have a huge bias and an incumbency bias effectively towards things that currently exist, but that does mean that we don't. No, I don't think anyone thinks that moving Shortland Street to 3 days a week and seemingly significantly narrowing its scope is likely to increase its audience.
I actually think there was probably some thinking around the idea that it might, right? Because they've, if you look at the way the show's changed, it's become much more fast-paced show, I guess. The cast has become younger. I think there wasn't...
And they might have
wasn't-
thought that, say, if you 3 days a week is less of a commitment than 5 days a week, so you can say it with the narrative.
Now
Sure.
it's more bingeable on, you only need an hour or so to binge the week's episodes on TVNZ+. I think there's lots of stuff. I think maybe this is less a question of immediate change and more a question of strong roadmap, right? Like we can just say, this is where we are now. This is what we think we need to achieve, and here's some ways towards it. And the MCH document goes partway towards that because it starts to talk about this is what we need to achieve in terms of what our funding bodies should look like, and a little bit to do with how we should relate to these global streamers that are in the environment. But it doesn't really kind of look at this is what we want to achieve in terms of what New Zealand storytelling and reaching New Zealand audiences looks like. And I think that's the bit that's missing. Is we need to define what we want to achieve in terms of the stories we want to tell and who we want to reach, and then think about, with those things defined, what we need to do to achieve them.
So let's imagine that, and it's actually quite possible that will happen, is that in the feedback to the document that is identified and it's on some level solved, that as this phantom Minister of Culture and
Don't
Heritage.
actually make me the Minister of Culture and Heritage.
I think we could do a lot worse.
Definitely,
but and we have done.
Yeah.
But let's imagine that happens. The sort of there's a slightly scary piece that is, will we still have the capacity to create it? Because we're living through this kind of nuclear winter now.
And that's kind of an interesting thing, right, as well. It's one of the arguments that doesn't come up when we talk about the spur. So when the spur gets argued about, and, we've got these things about a certain amount of, reinvestment in the economy, like X billion dollars worth of economic impact came out of X $100 million worth of rebate. What we don't talk about is also the capacity that builds, right? So if you think about the fact that we can shoot any film in New Zealand, like any international blockbuster. We had a Mission Impossible here, and we can only do that in New Zealand because we have facilities, equipment, and crew that can do that. We also shot a number of international reality series here recently. We shot Race to the Summit. There was a Lone Australia shot in New Zealand. And again, we can do those things because in New Zealand we have crew that are super experienced in that kind of stuff. And the longer we go with if we look at just the unscripted side of things, at the moment the industry is really shrunk, and a lot of the people who are, experienced story producers, reality camera operators, even experienced, post-production on that sort of side of things, are drifting off out of the industry or into, vague tangential parts of the industry. And if we want to bring up a show like that again, or if we want to bring, if they decided to do Survivor Fiordland, we would struggle to crew it. And the longer we sit in this position, the longer that happens, and that's the same with film and television. So there is, a part of it that if we want to be able to do these things and we want to have the capacity to tell our stories. And the reason we can make a New Zealand film so cheap is because the crew and the equipment have been subsidised by the international films we make at international prices. So, we need to kind of keep the whole thing going to make any of it work. If we stop local production, our crew gets atrophied. And if we stop international production, we don't have the resources locally. They're not subsidised by the international work. We can't make our stuff cheap.
I mean, you're an example of, experienced post-production crew who know how to make these things. I'm sure that you're friends with a whole bunch of others. And yet there hasn't been, Shortland St, which used to be a big employer, and indeed your employer, is vastly cut down and is basically finishing the year in July, which is, about 3 or 4 months earlier than it would have previous years. There aren't the big tentpole reality shows. What's everyone doing?
It's a really good question. So some of us are just kind of wandering around looking for little bits of work here and there. A few people have got, work. There is shows happening. There's production happening, but the scale of the production is smaller. So a lot of people have left the industry. Some people are working in corporate work. Others are trying to get their own things going. But fundamentally, it used to be, so Warner Brothers International TV Productions, formerly iWorks, formerly Touchdown, used to occupy 2 levels of a building in downtown Auckland, and those 2 levels were literally filled with edit suites, essentially filled with people sitting at desks editing reality TV shows. They now sort of occupy 1 level, and a lot of those computers are empty at the moment, and they'll pop up again. You've got another show, when another show pops up, there'll be some more people go in there, but all of those people, all of those editors and assistant editors and post producers and post directors have all sort of dissipated out, and the ones that weren't firmly established in the industry have kind of gone off to they're looking for little gigs here and there and corporate video work or whatever, and the ones who have kind of drifted off to other productions where they can, and then are just kind of scraping by with whatever otherwise. So I'm in the last group.
I'm genuinely very sorry to hear that.
It's okay.
In terms of what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and what has been sort of sketched out in the MCH document, do you think that what you're describing, that it will come to pass?
The future that I would like to see?
Or something closer to it. Like, do you sense...
I think we're going to have to head towards some of it. Some of those things are going to just sort of force themselves to be. I guess
what I'm asking is there sufficient urgency to match the kind of the scale and intensity of the problem, which is, like, I think being discussed in...
Yeah, I don't know. There are times, I see little glimpses of it where I think definitely there is. And the fact that report came out at all was incredibly reassuring in the sense that people are actually aware of the issues and are talking about it. But I still think, even if you look at that report, there's still a level of optimism about the nature of the industry, which maybe isn't necessarily matched by the reality of the industry. And I think, like, it's great that TVNZ is investing hundreds of millions or tens of millions of dollars in bringing their TVNZ Plus platform up to even better, so they can run better ads on it and make more ad revenue and whatever else it is they're doing in that respect. But still, the ad revenue they're going to get from an online ad on TVNZ Plus is nowhere near what they used to get for dropping a 30-second ad into the middle of, Shortland Street or The Flying Doctors or whatever, whatever shows were on TV once upon a time. Like, the overall revenue is dropping. The money that's available to the production companies is reduced. Like, we're not getting back to that, and I think there's still, in the discussion I see, I think there's still not necessarily an acceptance of that. There's still a we can just turn this around moment.
In addition to your work and...
Sorry, I'm very pessimistic.
No, I mean, I actually think this is just realism, and there probably hasn't been enough of it. And a lot of media exists on hope and that things will turn around, and production houses are always thinking about what the next pitch is, and that, they had decades of it working a particular way, and now it hasn't. It takes a while to metabolize that. In addition to your work in television, you've also written extensively about, and like one of the smartest people I know on the internet. The other thing that we've been talking about, the established industry for the most part, with obviously the exception of the likes of Viva la Dirt League, a lot of people are just opting out of watching professionally made, professionally produced content, at least as we understand it, through production houses entirely, and are much more in a UGC world. Even if you get away from a sort of a TikTok, Instagram area, even if you just look at YouTube, the amount of YouTube that's viewing that's happening on connected TVs and the amount which is functionally replacing that. Do you think there's a world where the likes of New Zealand On Air or the Spur can relate to that kind of thing? Or is that always going to be a separate lane which we can look at and be aware of, but none shall pass?
I think there has to be, or there will be at some point, and there kind of already is, right? They will consider those platforms for certain types of content. But the thing that's really interesting to me about when we talk about user-generated content is there's kind of 2 types. And one is what you consider the classic YouTube, which is just a dude with a camera doing a thing and filming himself and editing it. And the other is the TV sensibility brought to YouTube. And I'm really interested in the latter because I think there's a lot of growth there. So if you look at something like Try Guys is an interesting example. If you watch the Try Guys thing, they have made kind of almost a little network for themselves. They're making shows. They're making shows that look like television shows as a sort of American thing. Viva La Dirt League is doing sketch comedy, which it's something we haven't seen on New Zealand television for decades. I think there's a growth area in funding. It's kind of like podcasts, right? So, I can have a podcast in my garage and I can talk to my mate, just ramble about whatever shit that I want. Or we can, draft out an 8-episode series of an audio documentary series podcast, essentially. Or there's somewhere in the middle, which is like what this is, which is we were having a conversation, but it's structured and we've thought about it and it's got a broad theme and all of that kind of stuff. I think the growth of user-generated content that looks like platform-generated content is a really interesting area, and I think that we would be foolish if we didn't consider how to support that.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, there's all kinds of... The thing is, looking like television and having the same kind of constraints and checks and balances that television has are different things. But that might be a discussion for another day. Dylan, Thank you so much for coming up and for, especially given your background, your relationship to what television has been and would like to still be, to ask that kind of hard question that lurks behind a lot of the how can we just keep the band together for one more year that we're doing. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity because this is the stuff that I think about a lot, but I'm usually just shouting it into the void or telling my wife who doesn't care. So it's, a nice opportunity to talk to someone who will listen.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like an ongoing conversation and not one which is near done. So, no, but I really think that part of it was super important. So, thanks again.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.